Okay, so sorry for the delay in the start. So we're very happy to have Andrew Forcehimes from the Lingnan Technology University from Singapore. And he's going to give a talk, Welfare and the Fittingness-First program.
Right, so all good if I stand?
Yeah.
Okay. So first, thanks, Dan, and also James for helping arrange this talk. And yeah, I'm really glad to be here. Okay, so you have the handout. So a lot of this talk will be sort of chisoming through various principles. And so just bear with me a bit about that before I get to the positive bit. Okay, so advocates of the sort of Fittingness-First program have offered sort of constitutive accounts of large swaths of the normative domain, and evaluative issues are often thought to be the views, the program's kind of strongest selling point. So the idea there, basically, Fittingness-First program is just to try to account for the normative domain with fittingness working as the kind of the primitive, at least within that domain. And so, for example, one view that attracts a lot of consensus and has a great deal of plausibility is the idea that what it is for something to be desirable is for it to be fitting to desire. And like I said, that's a kind of like has a satisfying ring to it. But when it comes to welfare, there's nothing like that kind of consensus or that sort of satisfying ring that we can turn to. And since welfare is one of, I take it to be sort of an indispensable and central part of normative theorizing, I think it would be disastrous for the Fittingness-First program or any program to not be able to offer an account of it. So let me say briefly what I mean by constitutive account. I don't mean anything like conceptual analysis. What I mean is just a kind of a metaphysical account of what it is to be one thing in terms of something else. So what it is to be F in terms of G, what it is to be water, is for it to be H2O. And those are characterized by being asymmetric. So I'll use if and only if and because, and hence irreflexive. Irreflexive. Okay, so the background problem for sort of worries about welfare has to do with the fact that there's a lot of evaluative issues that cover very, very close to welfare, and we have to somehow, by using fittingness, carve out just welfare and not anything else. So just think about, we have good simpliciter, we have good for in the welfare sense that I'm interested in this talk. There's also the sense of good for in terms of contributing to sort of functional success, like oiling is good for a lawnmower, or watering is good for your plants. That sense, which is not the welfare sense. And then there's there's good in a way, there's epistemic goodness, and so on. And so the trick is that we need to target sort of all or only welfare using fittingness, and it's just not clear exactly how to do that. And so the general strategy has been to sort of start with that account that I mentioned at the beginning about what it is for something to be good simpliciter, or desirable is for it to be something that is fitting to desire, and then somehow prune and adjust maybe the attitude or the content, or even specify the fittingness relation in some way that so we hone in just on welfare. That's the sort of general strategy. So what I'll be doing at the first part of the talk is just to go through some existing proposals, say where they have problems, showcase that kind of pruning and adjusting, and eventually we'll end up with the proposal that I favor. And that proposal is that welfare is sort of intimately bound up with the desirability of occupying a certain phenomenal perspective. So I'll say a lot more about that once we get there, but that's sort of where I'm headed. Okay, so I've broken these somewhat artificially into different kinds of accounts. And the first one that we'll start with are what I call sake accounts. So doing something for someone's sake. Okay, so here's the first pass, and I'm going to omit magnitudes and times and the instrumental final value distinction unless the conversation sort of demands it. But for the most part, I'll just be able to. And I'm also going to just focus on the good side of the sort of good-bad polarity. It's kind of standard. So anyway, first pass. So sake accounts, X is prudentially good for S, if and only if and because it's fitting to desire X for S's sake. Okay, so there's a sort of well-known problem about this, which is that when it comes to desiring for someone's own sake, part of folk psychology to desire things for their own sakes, but to desire something for its own sake or someone else's sake is not part of folk psychology. So we have to be able to sort of cash out what that kind of desiring looks like. And the trouble is that once we try to spell it out, it looks like the account ends up being circular. So on a sort of most natural interpretation, for S's sake is going to amount to because one desires prudential goods for S, or maybe wishes S well. And if we have those, if that's what we have in mind, then on that interpretation, the account's going to amount to X is prudentially good for S, if and only if and because it's fitting to desire X, because one desires prudential goods for X, for S. And that looks hopelessly sort of circular. And so the solution is that we need to somehow replace desires prudential goods for S with something that doesn't make reference to prudential goods. And there does seem to be something in the vicinity, and this account is sort of made famous by Darwall, is to just substitute that bit of the equation with care or sympathetic concern. Okay, so substitute that in for the second pass. So X is prudentially good for S, if and only and because it's fitting to desire X, because one cares or is sympathetically concerned about S. Okay, and that does seem to mark an improvement. We have gotten rid of the circularity. But there's a sort of immediate problem, which is that it's unrestricted. So that latter part that comes where because one cares, our cares and our concerns can, just like you might have sort of beliefs that are false or desires that take improper objects, you could have cares that take improper objects. And so and it doesn't look like, and then we could desire things because we have those sort of cares and concerns. So so you could be you could care or be concerned about non-welfare subjects like plants, and it may be fitting to desire certain things obtained in virtue of those cares and concerns, but obviously those things cannot be prudentially good or bad because they're concerning non-welfare subjects. And so the solution is that since this is sort of driven by the fact that our cares might take improper objects, we just need to rule out this possibility by specifying that the cares and the concerns themselves are fitting. Okay, so that will take us to our third pass. So X is prudentially good for S, if and only if and because it's fitting to desire X, because it's fitting to care or be sympathetically concerned about S. So we just specified that the cares and concerns are fitting. That, by the way, is McHugh and Way's sort of loss on welfare. So one, I think, pretty serious problem that still remains with this is that it's still sort of too blunt. So even if we specify that the cares are fitting, or our concerns are fitting, cares and concerns themselves, they don't represent exclusively under the guise of welfare. So, so one way to see this is to recognize in welfare literature, there's this crib test, which is like, imagine your child as they're in their crib. When you're looking at them, like, what would you want their life to be like if you care or concern? And that's supposed to be sort of tracking what welfare is about. And one immediate problem that a lot of people have mentioned is that, well, even if you're caring and concerning about your child, you may be tracking other things like they're being morally good, or they're being, epistemically, if you're a philosopher, maybe, they're being epistemically virtuous, or all these other different ways in which they're evaluative features of a life, but they may not make that the child's life go better for the child living it. And so the problem is that unrestricted in this form, it looks like we're not going to be able to just home in exactly on welfare. So there is a kind of stipulative solution to this problem, which is just to say, well, look, there's some attitude, maybe we don't know exactly what its name is, but there's some attitude that, or attitude type, I should say, that's in the vicinity of care or sympathetic concern, and that exclusively tracks welfare. So maybe we'll evolve to have this attitude, our attitude will become more fine-grained or something like that. But we can just use that attitude. And we'll just, for our purposes, just call it C. So there's something in this vicinity, C. That attitude does represent exclusively sort of under the guise of welfare. Now, just note that this is not really an innocent assumption at this point, because without specifying C, we're sort of punting. And so we actually don't yield any definitive verdicts at this point. And so, all we can do is sort of make generic assumptions about this, and go from there. But even with just those generic assumptions, there are still sort of problems. So if we substitute in C, that's just going to give us pretty much the same thing, but X is prudentially good for S, if and only if and because it's fitting to desire X, because it's fitting to C about S. Okay, we just substitute that in. And now one problem with this is like, look, once we start thinking about what the nature of C is going to be like, it's an attitude type. It's kind of like care and concern, but it's a little bit more specific. It's just tracking welfare. And we realize that that's probably going to call for a pretty high level of sophistication. And the problem with that is that if we sort of look back on our evolutionary history, or even a possible evolutionary history, it's going to be the case that welfare subjects came into existence sort of long before the existence of any creatures that can have C. So whatever that attitude amounts to. And so why is that problematic? Well, it's problematic. If you're familiar with this, this is just a variant on what's known as the solitary goods problem. So we're going to have these welfare subjects, and there's going to be no one around to have C about them, basically. And even once we waited until creatures that have this particular attitude type, say, evolved, well, then it wouldn't be fitting for them to see about these creatures in the past because they're dead. They're not around anymore. So we sort of have this we get this non-overlap between creatures that can have C and the creatures that are welfare subjects. Welfare subjects appear long before C, and so we're just going to get there's going to be never a time at which it's fitting for anyone to see about these particular welfare subjects. Okay, so the natural solution, which is also a natural kind of solution to solitary good problems, is to make the account take some kind of counterfactual form. So that'll be our next pass. So X is prudentially good for S, if and only if and because, at the closest possible world where it's fitting to see about S, it's fitting to desire X because it's fitting to see about S. Okay. And one nice thing about if you take a counterfactual, if you take this kind of counterfactual account, is that it also solves our problem with C, whatever that attitude is, because we can just travel to the nearest possible world where we locate that attitude that exclusively represents under the guise of welfare, and there we go. We've located that attitude, and so as long as that attitude is possible, we can just imagine the possible world where people or creatures are having that attitude, and so that sort of solves our lingering worries about C. For what it's worth, for a while I thought this was actually the best account. Yeah. So anyway, so what's the problem with this particular account? Well, I think you can, with a little bit of creativity, get it to fall prey to standard kinds of conditional fallacies. So, the standard conditional fallacy is just to, when we adjust the antecedent to go to the nearest possible world where these creatures have C, we end up adjusting the relevant welfare related properties. And so I take it a lot of you are familiar with this from, say, the reasons literature. So if you go to a world where you're fully informed and rational, well, then you're not going to have any reasons to do things to become more fully informed and rational, and so forth. Okay, so same idea here. Basically, anytime we sort of travel to a world where S and C and the relevant welfare property somehow become sort of incompossible. So here's an example. So just you can plug in your favorite version of this. So I'll go with the version that I kind of prefer. So just think about certain kinds of what are called correspondence goods, like achievement or knowledge, or desire satisfactions, where you need to get some kind of match between mind and world. And then all we need to do is to imagine a creature that is incapable of C, but say desires or wants to achieve or whatever to become the fitting. What they want is to become the fitting object of C. So at the actual world, S is not the fit object of C, but S desires that today she makes progress towards being the fit object of C. And then suppose further that S fulfills her desire, she accomplishes her goal of making such progress, and she knows it. All of these seem like at least plausible candidates for making S better off, but as stipulated, S is not currently the fit object of C in the actual world. And so to see if this, this desire satisfaction, achievement, or knowledge is prudentially good for S, we look to the closest possible world where S is the fitting object of C. But this world is incompatible with S making progress towards being the fitting object of C because at this world, S is already the fit object of C. Okay. So by the way, you might be wondering, well, how could S be, or this kind of creature that could have achievements and knowledge and desire satisfactions, but not be the fit object of C? So I have two ways of spelling out the case. So I left it blank for you to fill in the details how you saw most compelling. In a version of the paper, the one that I actually favor is that S is really, really wicked, so wicked that they are unfitting of C. And what they're trying to do is like make up for their wickedness as they go along. So that's kind of the one I prefer. There's another one, which is that you can imagine that they're not capable of C, but they are capable of these like sort of less sophisticated attitudes like desires. And the way in which you become capable of having this particular attitude type is it's not sort of one that's sort of hardwired in, but instead it happens through like ontogenesis or sort of social conditioning. And so they're sort of making the steps needed in order for them to actually be the kind of creature that's capable of having. Okay, so you can spell out the details how you want, but that you can get the story up and running so that you get the counterfactual sort of fallacy. Sorry, conditional fallacy. Okay, so I think with stake accounts, so we're sort of driven through a series of, I think, hard to resist steps to adopting this counterfactual form, but that's going to drive us straight into the conditional fallacy. So we sort of have to look elsewhere. Okay, but there are other places to look. And this account, which it has a name that I don't actually like, but locative accounts, they draw inspiration from more because you try to locate the good within the person's life. Okay, so here's a kind of changing what needs to be changed from the Moorian kind of standard account. This would give us a sort of locative account first pass. X is prudentially good for S if and only if and because sort of either X is had by S and X is fitting to desire, or the fact that X is had by S is fitting to desire. Okay, so either versions. And as you probably know from this account has been around a while. It's famous for more, but there's a lot of problems with it, and this inherits pretty much all of those problems. So suppose beauty is fitting to desire, and this plant has a sort of a beautiful flower. Then the account tells us that this beautiful flower is prudentially good for the plant, but the plant's not a welfare subject. The other sort of problem is that with sadistic and undeserved pleasures. So a sadistic pleasure presumably is not fitting to desire, and undeserved pleasant experiences had by, say, the abominable or the wicked are not fitting to desire, and yet we want to say that these pleasures are prudentially good for the one experiencing them. Okay, so what kind of solution are we looking for? Well, the trouble with the Moorian account is that it's sort of the classical Moorian accounts just using good simplicitors. There's not a lot of room to wiggle. But with fittingness, you do have some more options to work with. And I think one of the more interesting ways to go is to try to rely on the fact that you can have idiosyncratically fitting desires, or sort of agent relatively fitting desires. What we can say is that in the case, say, of sadistic or undeserved pleasures, things like that, they're not desires that all of us, it's fitting for us to have, but it can be fitting sort of relative to the subject for them to have desires of this sort. So the idea here is that sadistic or undeserved pleasures are idiosyncratically fitting for S, but not for everyone to desire with respect to their being had by S. So sadistic pleasures are not fitting for everyone to desire with respect to S's experiences, yet it seems plausible to claim that they're idiosyncratically fitting for S to desire pleasure with respect to her experiencing them. After all, sadistic pleasures still feel good. And similar sort of remarks apply to undeserved pleasures. And one nice thing about doing it in this way is that it also rules out the problem of the plants and stuff, because it's going to be S's desires that are idiosyncratically fitting. So that will give us the second pass. So X is prudentially good for S if and only if and because it's fitting for her, but not for everyone to desire X with respect to its being had by S. Okay. Now one problem is that now it seems like we've ruled out too much. So we said that they can only idiosyncratically fitting desires matter for well-being, but it looks like there can be cases where actually it's fitting for everybody to desire that, say, this innocent pleasure had by just an innocent child is something that it's fitting for everybody to desire. And the account now rules that out. Okay, so what we actually need to do is capture both. So we need the solution that I think is called for, best way forward, is to say, well, we need to allow that it's fitting for everyone to desire, sort of to also count, and still allowing that sort of adjustment that let us rule out plants. So that will take us to the third pass. X is prudentially good for S, if and only if, and because either it's fitting for S, but not for everyone to desire X with respect to its being had by S, or it's fitting for everyone, S being a member of this set, to desire X with respect to its being had by S. Okay, so the first clause allows us to capture sadistic and undeserved pleasures, and the second clause then allows us to count innocent pleasures sort of had by innocent children. But the disjunction introduces new problems. So there are two problems. So suppose that you deserve pains. So consider the sort of abominable experiencing the pain that they deserve. It seems plausible to claim that such deserved pains are fitting for everyone, including the abominable to desire with respect to their being had by the abominable. So for example, suppose an abominable person, knowing and intentionally cause great suffering for fun, seems fitting for everyone to desire, including that abominable person. Again, it's fitting for desire. They might not desire this, but that would be unfitting. Okay, so, including the abominable, that this abominable person experienced the pain involved in, say, feeling guilt with respect to its being had, the sort of the guilt, the pain that's involved in feeling guilt with respect to its being had by this abominable person. And if that's correct, then the account tells us that these sort of negative but fitting, so like fitting guilt, are going to be prudentially good for the one having them, and that I think kind of strains credulity. Okay, the second thing that I think is problematic is that it's still too blunt. So it's fitting for everyone to desire that the elements of, say, a morally good life with respect to them being had by S, even in clear cases where these don't translate into welfare, say being morally virtuous or having a good will or making good on morality's demands. And it also seems that many of the elements of a meaningful, epistemically good, morally good, or even beautiful life are idiosyncratically fitting for S to desire with respect to their being had by S. But these goods say that S is the moral hero, or that she makes a particular meaningful contribution, or is in some privileged epistemic position, aren't necessarily prudential goods. Okay, so the sort of the general problem with locative accounts is that what we've been focusing on is S and then or X, the desirability of X, and then trying to relate it in the right sort of way to S. And I think the problem is that we're focusing on sort of the object of the desire is X rather than say S is life, which seems to be what we are interested in when we're interested in welfare. And sort of one way to see this is that notice that when I switched to talking about the fitting desires, I had to keep adding this with respects modifier to it. And so you can kind of see it which is like, these are good with respect to a certain thing. And so one way to bring this out is that what we want is actually the desirability of the life, and then the sort of elements of welfare to be the with the respects bit. But the locative account reverses that. And that's why we're always getting the wrong explanation. That's why we're always getting sort of pulled in opposite directions. We can't get that relationship finessed. So you say you might want to visit Sicily, both for the food and the weather, and you might prefer Sicily to Devon in these respects, but prefer Devon in respect to convenience. And as I think that example illustrates, we shouldn't say that we desire the food and the weather with respect to their being part of the Sicily visit. That would get things the wrong way around. And so we also shouldn't say that X is fitting for S to desire with respect to its being part of S's life. Rather, what we should say is that the object of the desire is having S's life, akin to the Sicily visit, with X being a feature that increases the desirability of having it, akin to the food that's part of the Sicily visit. So the desirability should be focused on S's life, say, rather than these parts that have been sort of incorporated in. Okay, and there's an account that does that, and so that's the next account that I'll look at. In fact, the account that I favor now is as sort of a restricted version of this account. So we're sort of heading, I think, in the right direction. What time should I?
So maybe so I guess we start another 20 minutes.
Okay, great. That's perfect. Okay, that's what. Okay, thanks. So this account we'll call the positional account. So to sort of understand this account, because it takes the life as the focus, we have to introduce magnitudes, which I've been omitting for now. So I'm just going to make a simplifying assumption and say that basically if something increases the desirability of someone's life, it's going to be proportional. That's going to be how proportionally good that thing is. Okay, so I'm just letting those two things sort of line up. So so X is prudentially good for S, according to the positional account, to degree D, if and only if and because it raises the strength of the desire, it's fitting for S to have towards having S's life to degree D. Okay, so the one thing that's really hard to understand about this account, at least initially, is what exactly is a life, and in particular, what is it like? Well, you'll see why this starts to look problematic for certain reasons, but the one answer, this is the answer that Campbell gives, and Bradley seems to suggest something in this direction, which is basically just a life is just if we just assign every single property that you possess during your life, during your complete existence. So every property that S has, even relational properties, that's gonna capture a life. Another way to think about it is every state of affairs that S is a constituent of. If we could write them all down in like a biography, that would be S's life in a sense. And what we're saying is how desirable is sort of that whole package. That's one way to think about it. Now, why is that's sort of puzzling or hard to understand? Well, one thing that's really hard to understand is whether or not that's something that you could desire, like whether you could actually have a desire with that content. It looks troubling, and also might look troubling because it looks like very sort of permanent welfare subjects aren't going to have desires with that kind of complicated content. So we might have to do some finessing, but I think there are bigger fish to fry. So I'll just start with what I think are really two big obvious objections, and that will sort of push us, I think, in a way that actually solves that problem as well. So one problem is that, again, it's too blunt. So I keep coming back to this issue, which is that so you might have a life that has these evaluative features, aesthetic, moral, epistemic, and it might increase the desirability of being in that position, of having that life. but that kind of desirability of the life doesn't automatically translate into welfare. So it seems plausible to maintain that some features of a moral life or an epistemically virtuous or a meaningful life or a life that's excellent, a flourishing life or a beautiful life, they raise the strength of the desire that it's fitting for one to have towards this life, but they're not features that, again, that automatically yield welfare. So that's, again, it's just too blunt. And some defenders of the positional account just accept that. They say, yeah, actually being morally virtuous or whatever, we welcome that verdict. I'm skeptical of that. And there's another way to see the problem, but this relies on some controversial bits of philosophy of mind. But I'll try to make it a little bit more palatable. So one problem is that you could imagine that, say, a sort of an organism that has a unique evolutionary history. So it has a normal intentional states, affective and cognitive, but it doesn't have any phenomenal consciousness. So it's sort of evolved zombie. And when considering this organism, this is sort of building on the last objection, it might be plausible to maintain that, again, these are controversial epistemologists as well, but that it has some epistemically virtuous features of its life. And it might even sort of, in its zombie way, make meaningful contributions. And it might be an excellent member of its species. And these might increase the desirability of its having that life. But it doesn't seem plausible to say that they could make its life go better for the subject living it. And why is that? Because I'm inclined to think that's not a welfare subject at all without phenomenal consciousness. So that a welfare subject requires sort of at least the capacity for phenomenal consciousness, I think, is one of those things that we should definitely try to retain or capture in our account. And I think this account seems to violate it pretty quickly. Let me just say a few things about this example, because I know it's controversial. So one way to finesse the example a little bit in a way that's nicer is like, so if you've got, say, theories of content, for example, that you think you need to have phenomenal consciousness, then just imagine that you sort of get your content up and running, and then it sort of zombifies itself like a sea squirt that eats its own brain. So it's like part of its existence is sort of lived with both, and then sort of halfway through it just sort of sucks out of that consciousness. So I think that makes it a little bit easier. The other way to think about it is like another way to go is just imagine that it's sort of normal, but then it's a deeply Freudian creature in a similar way. So it goes through, and then everything, all of its life just becomes sort of lived unconsciously afterward. Again, you get that kind of story going if you've got the thought that say certain attitudes or whatever, they need to at least possibly be conscious. Well, just front load that into the life and let the back half go in the way I described. Okay, so again, so let me just say a little bit more about the welfare subjects bit. I'll come back to it in a moment. But I think there's a real sense in which if something has sort of zombified itself, that it's a kind of first-person death. And without that point of view, to speak of one's own good or what's good for me hardly makes sense. And that's this sort of sentience requirement on welfare subjects is a pretty popular thought, and I'm just drawing. So one way to solve the problems is sort of drawing inspiration from the idea that there's this intimate connection between welfare and phenomenal consciousness, is that we might try to retain the structure of the positional account, but narrow it to focus on S's life, not on from S's life, but just to the sort of the point of view, or S's experiential point of view, or what it's like to be S. And I think that also helps with the problem I sort of briefly mentioned about the content of the relevant desires, because all you need to be thinking about is sort of like what it is to be you at that time, whether or not that is desirable. And that seems like something that you would be able to feed in, at least to the even very primitive creatures, the object of their sort of desires. So what it's like to be me right now, I can desire that. Right. Good. You know, there's a connected story that like people like Peter Godfrey Smith tell about how sort of consciousness evolved, that involves this sort of having a sense of self and having certain affective attitudes, very primitive ones. And so I'm kind of sort of tapping into that story. So it seems like we're at least in the right vicinity for all these parts being plausible elements that we could sort of easily plug in. Okay, so I'll call that the perspective account. So again, it works very similar to the positional account, but just restricted. So X is prudentially good for S to degree D, if and only if and because X raises the strength of the desire it's fitting for S to have towards having S's phenomenal perspective, S's experiential point of view, or what it's like to be S to degree D. So again, we're not focusing on all and only S's properties. We're just talking about all and only S's phenomenal properties at a given time. Okay. So one virtue of this account is that it does really well with all the problems that we seem to have encountered before. So welfare subjects are guaranteed to be conscious, and with welfare anchored in what it's like to be S, we eliminate other ways of evaluating lives for making a difference to S's welfare when intuitively they shouldn't. So to make a difference, being moral or reasoning to a great discovery or making a meaningful contribution or being epistemically virtuous or having a beautiful ending to your life, they all must adjust the desirability of occupying S's phenomenal perspective. So they can matter, but only insofar as they sort of directly increase the desirability of occupying S's first person point of view. And I think that fits pretty well with our confidence about whether something can make a difference to our welfare. So I'll skip over that. I have a little bit of a few things to say about that, but I can say them in Q&A if they come up. Okay, so the obvious problem is that it's too restricted. So I went from all of the light down to this huge jump into phenomenal consciousness. And so, you know, doesn't it fall prey to experience machine counterexamples, doesn't rule out the desire, satisfactions, and knowledge that you sort of mentioned above. And I think the answer to that is no. And so let me just motivate the solution that I would have to that kind of objection. So I think fitting attitude accounts, the Fittingness-First program in general fits really well with what's known as conditionalism about value from value theory. So conditionalism about value theory is just the rejection of the sort of Morean goodness, which is just that about something to be intrinsically valuable, it has to supervene on the intrinsic properties of that thing. Conditionalists say no. What they say is that instead of saying going in for organic unities or things like that, what we can say is that things outside the extrinsic properties, the non-intrinsic properties, can modulate the goodness of the intrinsic properties of a thing. So the classic example are, say, Abraham Lincoln's pen to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. We can imagine it's intrinsically identical to lots of other pens, but its value is modulated by the fact that it was causally sort of involved in this momentous event, or Princess Diana's dress, things like that. Okay, and so the reason why these are sort of a non-ad hoc sort of combination is that both of these views, fitting attitudes accounts of value, this Fittingness-First accounts, and conditionalism, they both rely heavily on this connection between our valuing practices and value. So they try to sort of, if one way to motivate the Fittingness-First program in general is to say, well, look, we want to be able to chart this middle path between subjectivism, which we just rely completely to say on our desires, and primitivism, which we get with a sort of Morean view. And how do we do that? Well, we link together our valuing practices with value through fittingness. Okay, so that's how we do it. Conditionalism often motivates their view by saying, well, look at these cases, look at how our valuing practices work. We don't just value things for their own sake on account of just their intrinsic properties. Rather, we go and we look at lots of their extrinsic properties as well, so we value things for their own sake. because of the way that they relate to these other things, like the rarity of something or whatever. And so they both draw this connection. And what I'm saying is, yeah, we should embrace that connection. We don't have to, but it's not an ad hoc solution. It's one that is sort of available for the Fittingness-First program to sort of reach out for. Okay, and so what does that do to help us? Well, what we can say is that the value, the evaluative properties are attaching to the object itself, but they're getting modulated by these other conditional on these other extrinsic factors. And so what we can say is that the value, welfare value, prudential value, latches on to the phenomenal perspective of a person, say at a time, but it can be modulated by things outside of that perspective. So the non-intrinsic properties. And so how would you, and why does this help with these problems? Well, it means that we can violate, say, the experience requirement on well-being, and say that changes in well-being have to involve changes in one's phenomenology. We can say that your phenomenology can be how good a particular point of view is, say, or how desirable it is for you, can be modulated by things outside of that perspective. And so that looks very good if you want to capture, say, desire satisfactionism or knowledge, or that your life is worse in the experience machine. Okay, so let me just briefly talk about those, and then I'll save the rest for Q&A. So think about the experience machine. I don't like the version where you're plugging in because it's a choice and there's lots of problems with that. But just do a standard kind of contrast case. So there's your life lived inside of an experience machine, and then your exact same life lived outside. Does the connection to reality make a difference? Intuitively, at least a lot of people have the intuition that it does. But we can capture that if we accept conditionalism, if we can sort of couple the view, the perspective account with conditionalism. Why can we capture that? Because we can say that even though you have the same experiences in and out of the machine, the experiences in the machine are more desirable, or out of the machine are more desirable because they're veridical in some way, or they're this cost in some vertical way. Okay, so that's how I would do it with the experience machine. Okay, what about desire satisfactionism? Well, in order for then desire satisfactions to make a difference to your welfare, according to the perspective account, they're going to have to make a difference to your conscious experience. But that, I think, seems plausible. So we can say that, say, all conscious desires that are satisfied make a difference. And that sort of actually puts us well within the normal range of desire satisfactionism. A lot of people, when they hear, say, Parfit's stranger on a train case, where you meet someone and then they tell you their ambition, so they're sick or whatever, and then that actually happens, but you never learn about it long in the future. It looks like you're not benefited, but your desire is satisfied. And the thought is, one reaction to that kind of case is that, well, you're just never made aware that your desire is satisfied, and that's the problem. Similarly, Kagan has a version of this where you hope that all the atoms in the universe, when they all are added up, they're prime. You're like a prime number lover, and the thought is, why can't that make you better off? Well, because you can never be made aware of it. You can never be made conscious that this desire was satisfied. So if you accept that standard, well, I think it's well, Heathwood likes this one, but anyway, I think is a really nice way of understanding those cases. Then the account can just piggyback on that and say, well, if you accept conditionalism, then you just think those kinds of desires benefit you on the condition that they're satisfied. And the same goes for last one is knowledge. So you can imagine two identical phenomenal perspectives, A and B. A is in world one, while B is in world two, and both have a sort of a conscious belief that P, which means all the conditions on knowledge, except that P is true in W1, but false in W2. And the perspective account can then claim that it's fitting to have a stronger desire to occupy A compared to B, insofar as that perspective includes a conscious belief that qualifies as knowledge, whereas B does not. So again, you're just modulating it based on extrinsic properties of the phenomenal perspective. So just a last, just like, maybe 1 minute, just bit is that it would be really nice to be able to explain why there's this intimate connection between being a welfare subject and being at least capable of phenomenal consciousness. And the perspective account offers a really, like, that's something that I think kind of cries out for explanation. And I think the perspective account can offer a really neat explanation of why that's the case, because the perspective account basically says that welfare requires consciousness because what it is to fare well is tied to the desirability of occupying a certain phenomenal perspective. So I'll just go in.
Hey, James, why don't you start, and everyone else keep their hand.
Yeah, thanks a lot, super interesting, and I like the move you're making at the end. My question, I guess, has to do, I guess it's a question, I guess, to the fittingness program in general, but I'll just focus on the perspective, account.
Yeah.
So basically, I'm wondering if it gets things backwards. So it seems plausible that the reason that it's fitting the more strongly desire to occupy S's phenomenal perspective, is that S has more welfare.
Yeah.
So like what makes it fitting is facts about welfare. Like welfare is the explanation of fittingness rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
You can sort of see that like the experience machine, like why would that be a sort of connection? Why would it be fitting to lower the strength of desire? Well, it's because they have less welfare. That can't be the answer, right? Because then it's circular.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess
Yeah,
my
yeah.
question is like, what else could explain the fittingness if it's not welfare?
Okay, yeah, this is a general problem
Yeah.
for the program in general. Okay, so let me give you the answer that I'll just give you my own theory about this, but it's a nonsense. I think it's non-standard. So I think all this relates back to the nature of the desire, like the attitude in question. So let's just forget welfare. I don't mean to, but just use the simpler stuff. So why, like, what's the connection between desire and desirability? And you might think, well, look, obviously what's going on is, say, if you've got a desire that's fitting, it's fitting because its object is desirable. That's the direction that you're saying the explanation should run. You see what I mean?
Yes.
So I was like, why would this desire that P be fitting? Well, it's because P is desirable, and that's why it's like satisfied its correctness condition in that direction. Yeah. No, I'm very sympathetic to this law. Here's the explanation I would give. It's a long story, but very, very roughly, if you want to understand what makes a certain attitude fitting, I think you have to understand. Sorry, I'm just gonna say a bunch of really controversial stuff, and so okay, just like here, like what would make it fitting? Well, that has to do with the nature of the attitude in question, and I think we can get a good grip on it if we say we turn to belief. So if you want to say why is belief fitting, and I think if you say, well, because it's true, that fits. You're like, well, then you should say the same thing about desirable. It's because it's desirable. Blah 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 blah. But what I want to say is that no, what makes it fitting has to do with the function of that attitude, and not the function in the Cummins function sense, but instead functions in the teleofunctional sense. So desires have a certain kind of function. They're supposed to do something. They have a certain job to do, and then I think you should say the same thing about beliefs. They have a certain job to do, and so on and so forth. If we accept C has a certain job to do. So we're going to identify them or type identify them in virtue, basically, of a standard kind of Neander-Millikan story about functions. Okay, now then, what makes them fitting? Well, they've taken the object that they need to take in order to fulfill their function. Now, if you run it that way, then the explanation actually shoots back out the other side of the attitude. What has made that thing fitting is not that it's satisfied, say it's desirable, or that it's the belief is true, rather that it's taken an object, the object that the attitude in particular has taken has all the properties that it needs to have in order for that attitude to sort of do the job that it's supposed to do by nature, like that Mother Nature gave it. That's the story I would tell. But if you just like treat them as brute facts, like there's just these attitudes and we need to understand them, then I think then you have to go that direction, because you're going to explain their fittingness in terms of sort of like accuracy or something like that. Yeah, anyway, that's how, yeah, so I was just like, wait till I defend that elsewhere. Yeah, but anyway, that's the view I take.
Yeah, thanks. It's really interesting. And I learned a lot. So this is a clarificatory question, I think, about trying to understand the sense in which the view that you describe allows desire satisfaction to make a difference. So just here's a case. Suppose Dan and I have the exact same phenomenal perspective. And in particular, we both have a conscious desire to be the best philosopher in the world. And unbeknownst to either of us, Dan is the best philosopher in the world.
Okay.
So I would say, like, but we go through both our lives being phenomenal duplicates the whole time.
Yeah.
So is that a case where
Yeah.
his perspective is more desirable than mine because it's conditioned by the truth of his being the best philosopher ever? And if so, well, sorry, I just let you answer that.
No, it's really, so I actually gave two views of how you would try to do this. And it depends on your answer. I got a bit nervous at the end and I started muddling stuff together. Sorry, so I apologize. So there's one view that says, well, look, all the account needs to say is that as long as you have this, like, there's something to latch onto, that you've got this element of your psychology that part of your perspective is both involves this desire. Well, I can just say that sort of the desirability of your perspective increases insofar as I guess it'd be Dan's desire is satisfied.
Yeah.
Because he is in fact the best philosopher. So it's like that desire boosts your overall the overall desirability of that phenomenal perspective insofar as it's satisfied. So that's one way to go. Now I take it that you might say, yeah, but you're like same on the inside.
Well, I like that answer, so I'm satisfied.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's what I would say. So it's just like all that's happening is just that desires that are satisfied end up giving a boost in terms of the desirability of that phenomenon.
But it does seem like his desire satisfaction never makes a difference in his conscious experience. His desire does, but his satisfaction doesn't, because he never.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But as long as you've got something as a feature of the phenomenology to latch onto, then I can modulate its value, how good or bad it is for you, even if it's based on these extrinsic things like it's being satisfied. You see what I mean? So I'm going to violate the experience requirement, like so that the two identical phenomenal experiences you can't really change without a change. And those you guys are going to be the same. So I'm violating that. That's one way to tell the story. The other, if you're happy with that, I'll just stop. Okay. The other way to tell a story would be something like this. It doesn't work unless you're conscious that your desire is satisfied. And that would be a slightly different account. But again, I don't have to actually answer the like I can remain neutral on which first order theory, substantive theory of well-being is true. I just want to say that this account doesn't rule out these like really obviously plausible contenders. And if you adopt conditionalism, you sort of couple it with conditionalism, then you don't rule those out at least automatically. Does that make sense? So we can still fight about the details at that first order level.
I have a follow-up, but it's long, so I'll wait until.
You can follow.
Okay, so then, yeah, so that sounds good to me, but I worry that it's in effect letting everything back in the sense that, yeah, so we could do the same thing with like morality, that suppose, you know, I'm in heaven waiting to be reincarnated or whatever, and I have an option of two perspectives, and they're phenomenally just alike. But I'm told, oh yeah, except one of these perspectives is the perspective of a real bastard, and the other is a great person. It seems like one of these is more desirable than the other, or it's more fitting for me to desire this rather than that, because of this extrinsic fact about the two perspectives. But
I don't know how you get the bastard. I guess being a bastard requires some. Is that the other person is an unsuccessful bastard?
Maybe it's you. The angel tells me like you can be this guy for a day, or you can be that person for a day. So it's just a day, or like.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah, it does let a lot back in. Like, so let me. The short answer to is yeah, it's going to let a lot in. But if there isn't, that's why I kept saying, as long as you've got the conscious desire as part of the phenomenal.
Why do I even have to have a desire? When we just say it's an extrinsic fact about these conscious experiences are had by someone who is morally terrible. And that extrinsic fact seems relevant, just in the same way that being terrible seems relevant. It's just a different way of stating the same fact.
Yeah, okay, I think it's, hold on. Let me make sure I understand. Oh, so the idea is like, as long as you allow for, for extrinsic properties to count.
And that's kind of just a way of restating that other things can count. in
Yeah,
addition
yeah,
to
yeah,
experience. Or that would be I mean, maybe you think that that's not really the same, but
It's not exactly the same. Well, let me see if this helps. So we need to be able to tell some plausible story about how it would modulate the desirability of occupying that particular perspective. In the so for example, if you said, look, there are these two phenomenal perspectives, and then one of them is housed in a body that's a certain distance from the moon, and the other one is housed in another body that's like a slightly different distance from the moon. Then you could so at least we have the machinery to allow that to count. And so let me just give the answer that way, because the moral case is making me a bit flummoxed about how the bastard stuff is working. Partly because I think you have to have some changes in the consciousness of the person who's bastard versus not a bastard. So I don't know how we're like equalizing the two cases. But let me just say this. So in outline, yeah, we have the machinery to say that being a certain distance from the moon makes a difference. Now, that's fine, because then we just need to come in with a first order theory that then spells out the details about that. About why exactly this would modulate, say, the strength of the desire befitting for you to have towards occupying that phenomenal perspective. And the thing is, at the first order level, I think we just wouldn't be able to say anything on that front about the moon case. It's just irrelevant. You see what I mean? But yeah, so in the bastard case, it's a little bit different. So you're worried that I let in all the stuff that I was sort of, it's like too blunt.
yeah,
Yeah,
I'm worried that if we make a list of stuff that we're worried is being captured when it shouldn't be because it's too blunt, then I could just restate that same list, except describe it in terms of extrinsic properties of a phenomenal perspective. So if it's if we shouldn't let in virtue and beauty and stuff like that, then I can restate that as well, now we are letting in the property of occupying a perspective of someone who's excellent and of someone who's virtuous, and that's kind of feels like it's a distinction without a difference.
Okay, let me say why I hope it doesn't make a difference. I see the worry. So the thought I can write with you. Yeah. Okay. So the thought that I was mainly worried about before is where, say, the desirability, what was increasing its desirability, say, let's just say like some epistemic features. Okay. And it's direct. So it's like somehow being epistemically virtuous just makes your life better off. And the sort of the goodness making property is being epistemically virtuous. You see what I mean? Now, in the case, if the perspective account is right, that always has to be mediated by the consciousness stuff over here. So actually what's always desirable is like this can come to play a role modulating how desirable it is, but the possessor of the desirability is always the consciousness. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So my hope is that when you say, yeah, that makes the consciousness more desirable, you say, okay, yeah, that does, and that also corresponds to that person having a more desirable phenomenal perspective. That's what we're focusing on. And that translates into welfare, as opposed to just saying the sheer fact that they're epistemically virtuous is desirable. And it's being epistemically virtuous that has the evaluative property of being desirable, which doesn't look like it translates into welfare. So the thought was that as long as it's mediated by consciousness, then I'm okay. Does that help? Maybe you think, no, that's like a distinction without a difference or something.
I'm not sure. I'd like to keep going back and forth about it, but maybe.
Let me try one more time. Can I try one more time?
No, I mean.
Yeah, just to clarify, because I maybe I'm not, just imagine the Diana dress example. Yeah, okay, okay. Let's
Just
do it.
think process.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
up from there. I'm tempted to just let go, but I just have this example just to help in. So we can imagine two people who have the same exact experiences and they're doing the same exact thing. They're just hitting a button. So one person, and they're experiencing the same amount of pleasure, but one person is getting pleasure from hitting a button and, making everyone's life better. The other person's getting pleasure from every time they do it, they make someone suffer. So
And
like,
when they're thinking about the button pushing, do they know the implications? Then they're gonna have a difference in the content of what's going on. Okay, yeah, okay.
something there.
I can imagine someone being the reason why I said they don't make a difference, it's like you can imagine a bastard that tries to do everything, but they're always flummoxed. So then their bastardhood never gets to like make it to other people.
Terminology is just distinctive of being a bastard. They don't have it all the time. It's not like there's some quality of evil that's always.
Oh, yeah. Okay. It's like flickering on and off.
Some innocent moment, they could be phenomenally like.
Yeah.
But it's still true that they're a bad person, and occupying that perspective means.
I see. Okay, I see. It's like you can occupy them on like their Sunday when they have a day off,
Yeah.
bastard or something. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Adam. Great, no, thanks for the talk. Actually, I have a question a bit similar to Dan Palley's first question, but maybe I'll put it like this. What is it that you mean by the notion of a point of view and perspective? So as I hear it, a point of view or perspective is a type of thing rather than a particular thing. In the sense that two people can share a perspective or point of view. Like in the example Dan gave, Dan and Dan, coincidentally, share the same point of view.
Oh, I see.
But if they share it, it's got to be something abstract or, for first approximation.
Yeah.
And so then, but then later you want, and then that's the intuition, like in the experience machine, like
Yeah.
Bob in reality and Bob Starr in the experience machine, they have exactly the same perspective, exactly the same point of view, exactly the same phenomenal perspective, exactly the same what it's like to be the one is exactly what it's like to be the other. Those are all more or less stipulated in the thought experiment. But then it seems like your answer to like Dan's question is predicated on saying, well, actually, no, Dan and Dan have different points of view. And there's a reading where that's true. If you're talking about the particular points of view,
Yeah.
Dan's got his and Dan's got his.
Yeah.
And so that's like an admissible reading. But I worry that there's actually a slide in your argument or between the thing that makes it very plausible and familiar, which is the understanding of a point of view as something that can be shared. And then when you get into these issues about like desire satisfaction or these like extrinsic properties mattering, then you need to say that Dan's desire is satisfied because it's related to some extrinsic thing. That Dan's desire is not satisfied because it's not related to the extrinsic thing. So you said they have different perspectives or points of view. And there are like metaphysics of mind or like perception that allow you to say that, like you get into like disjunctivism or like prime mental states.
Yeah.
But I think to make that work, you're going to need some like fancy footwork about like anti-luminosity or because they're going to be weird things. So like I can't know from the inside what my point of view is because I can't. If what you're saying is right, then and then that's going to make it also really weird for subjects to like desire. Do subjects desire token as opposed to type?
I get what you're
Especially
saying.
if they're indiscriminate. Like I desire his rather than his, but if you put them in front of me, nothing I could do could tell them apart. So I worry that if you go that route, you're going to face all kinds of very difficult questions about,
So yes, so let me the Dan and Dan case is hard because like the name is different. So
Try to make it tricky.
Yeah. So let me just try to.
Where's Bob and Bob Starr in the experience?
Yeah. So I'm going to say Bob and Bob Starr, if the experience machine does everything the experience machine is supposed to do, and Bob and Bob Starr have they have the same point of view.
Yeah.
And these cases where I was saying things like, well, if the one has satisfied desires and the other one doesn't, that leaves their point of view exactly the same. The only thing that's adjusting is the desirability of that point of view.
But desirability of which point? The one they both share?
No, so. Oh, I see what you're saying, because it's a type. No, just the token.
But they have the same one.
Yeah, I know, but they do, but it's not the same in all, it's intrinsically the same, but its relational properties are different because one includes a desire that is relationally satisfied and the other one doesn't. See what I mean? So again, when you mentioned the luminosity, I'm not trying to say anything like that. I'm not saying there's secretly a difference in terms of the intrinsic properties of the point of view. I'm gonna say they're the same. It's just that the desirability, the evaluative properties that attach to the point of view are gonna be different.
But it's just one final thing. I didn't say anything about the intrinsic, I just said same, you either have the same or different point of view.
So yeah, I get what you're saying. There's an ambiguity about how to state this. So I'm gonna say, if we're being really clear, they don't have the same point of view in terms of all of its properties, including extrinsic properties. But they do have the same point of view in terms of the intrinsic properties. So all I was saying is that the desirability of the point of view that includes the relational property, extrinsic property, I'm gonna count that. And that's gonna be different in terms of its desirability. That's all I want to say.
Okay.
You asked like a really interesting question also about like, how do we want to capture points of views? I was being like intentionally a bit like sloppy about this, partly because I'm not. So there's like, so like if I like this idea, I like the idea that there's this kind of unity to consciousness. But I also think that even if there is like the unity of consciousness thesis is true, that we can pick out individual properties of each one that might be different. So that's why I sometimes waffle back and forth between like your experiential properties and point of view. I think point of view is more naturally talking about the unified bit. And then when I want to pick out something that's different, I'll say, well, this sort of, in particular, this particular experiential property. But if you go from top down or bottom up, I don't really care so much. That's all that I meant.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
Peter.
Yeah, thanks. So I had a question that was very similar to James's first question. So instead I'll ask a potentially weird follow-up.
Okay.
Maybe a matter of curiosity mainly. So I was just wondering if there's something like a Fittingness-First program applied to belief, as opposed to desire, and what that might look like.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a case where you have Fittingness-First where the primitive is taking what makes a belief fitting is the primitive, and you're trying to explain, for example, what it is for a state of affairs true in terms of that?
No. Well, I mean, the short answer is that's not a popular view.
Okay.
Yeah. So you wouldn't try to explain truth in terms of.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds crazy.
Yeah,
So I was sort of wondering if that bears against the whole program, right? Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't sound wonderful to me for James's sort of reasons for trying to explain
Yeah.
welfare in terms of desire. Then you switch to the belief case, and it really starts to sound bad to start fitting this with belief first before
Yeah.
it's like truth of it. Yeah.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think the way to do that is like, I don't think that I don't think what we should be doing if you adopt this as a sort of Fittingness-First program is to say, well, look, yeah, here, maybe I'll try to explain this. So there is a variant of this, more charitably, a variant of this program that says, look, actually what fittingness is really, it's all alethic. So what makes belief and desire and like even intention and so forth is that there are certain thoughts implicit in those attitudes, and insofar as those thoughts are true, then the attitude is fitting. So if you thought what it is for something to be fitting blame, it's just that you would have this sort of suite of reactive attitudes associated with blame, and the thoughts that are constitutive of those kinds of reactive attitudes, they're accurate. So there is that program. I don't like that program because I think it doesn't work for a lot of attitudes. And what's more is I think I was hinting at it before. I actually don't think that's what. There's another reason, which I think is that fittingness doesn't just apply to attitudes. And once you apply it to other things like actions, then you're in a real mess because actions don't represent anything. So they don't have any kind of alethic verticality, any kind of conditions like that. Okay. So for example, just to go back to the one that I just used, if you think that blaming is more than just attitude, but also it's something you do, and you think that it can be fitting or unfitting, which I think that's true, then you're not going to be able to explain that element of blame in terms of, or at least you'll have some acrobatics to perform in terms of representational accuracy. Okay, so there's that. I think intention is a good case for that as well. So there is that program. I think you're exactly right that it wouldn't make any sense to go in for, say, truth and then try to explain it, in terms of, say, accurate belief. Fitting belief. So I don't think that's gonna work. Now, in terms of how disastrous that is, if you start with sort of truth as a model and belief as a model, how disastrous is it? Well, I think it's not so bad. And here's the reason why I think it's maybe not so bad. Is that when we're talking about the fittingness of a certain attitude, we are really focusing on the attitude itself. And unlike truth, where you don't think like truth that bears some special kind of connection to say belief, it's like you think truth came first and then there's belief afterwards. It's not like we need beliefs to sort of show up. That's not true. I don't think you have the same kind of thoughts, or at least I can talk myself into the thoughts that, well, prior to there being any desirers, maybe there wasn't anything that was like desirability. Kind of doesn't make sense. So think about evaluative terms. It's like, was there anything that's like enviable prior to any creatures that could envy? And maybe not. And if you think that thought, then you can say belief and the relation to truth is not the model we should be using. We should be thinking about the kinds of thick evaluative properties that we normally associate with our sort of more human attitudes.
Yeah, kind of, I mean, I don't know enough.
But I think it's a great question. I mean, like,
Yeah.
I think this is for the program in general, but.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my inclination, my naive inclination is to think that welfare is something like the analog of truth.
I see.
In the desire case, so, yeah, welfare can exist before the desires.
I see.
And, you know, if you mean by something being desirable, it's just like, well, you know, for what that means is that it's fitting to desire and it's fitting to desire because it's good for that, for you or whoever you told. So maybe you can have welfare facts before you have desire fact. And welfare explains what desirability is downstream. Yeah. But anyway.
No, I think it's really good. But so I talked about, say, being a welfare subject. You know, and one kind of the capacity for consciousness is often thought to be a sort of in order to be a welfare subject, you have to have what's distinguished as like a rock, a dog, is that they have this capacity for consciousness. Another requirement that's like right in the vicinity of that is that you need to at least have some effective, very minimally like, you know, balanced states. So James is right in this vicinity of having valence. So if you have that view, then you won't have these cases where, oh, there's like no balanced states, you know, positive or negative, or like engaged, right? Yeah, okay. Like, yeah, effectively engaged states. You're not gonna have any effectively engaged states. You need that in order for welfare to sort of start showing up. So they're gonna go hand in hand. So I would try to answer it that way. You're not gonna get any welfare, and then there's just like everything is valued. Everything is just neutral, doesn't care what happens to it, it's just indifferent. You wouldn't have sort of welfare properties and
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks.
So I've got a question. So what, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what makes this like a desire fitting. What is it for a desire to be fitting? So from what I picked up, there's like the idea that desires have functions, or have a function. And, and so for a desire to be fitting, it's doing a good job at fulfilling its function. So what is the function of desires? And
Can I use a simpler one? So think about fear. Can I just use fear first and then maybe work our way up? So think about what would be the function of fear. Well, I kind of standard thought about the function of fear is that it sort of triggers flight and fright mechanisms in the face of realistic threats. So the kind of things, if you fear, say, cotton balls, that would be unfitting. Why is that? Because the object of your fear that is supposed to trigger these fight or flight mechanisms are supposed to be realistic threats, and cotton balls are not realistic threats. Okay. So that would be the story I would tell. So there are certain properties that an object needs to have in order for it to fulfill its function, and not just fulfill its function, but fulfill its function in the right way by the mechanisms that by which fulfill this function when it was selected for. So you tell some story about that. That's to rule out like deviant causation kinds of cases. Anyway, so if you think that's the way to go for fear, then desire is harder because I think desire is actually kind of a cluster attitude for philosophers. But you could see it as being, at least the story that I like is that you see it's the most broad category of catching things that are sort of adaptive or maladaptive in your environment. That's how I would tell the story. So it's your most primitive sort of like, this thing is going to make me get less of my chances. You're not gonna think all these thoughts, but you're gonna have this trigger that this thing is sort of going to be in some way adverse to mine. Or maladaptive or adaptive. So you're gonna end up the flip side. So you're gonna end up desiring things that ultimately allow you to maintain yourself long enough to reproduce. Very roughly.
Finger from,
Yeah, so then if you start eating poison, if you desire poison or something like that, if you desire to eat poison, then that's gonna be unfitting. Why is it gonna be unfitting? Because you eat poison, you're gonna die before you can reproduce.
so the function of desire is to do what? Is it to
Basically,
make you reproduce something or what?
well, no, so it would be that. The thought was that the properties that the object of a desire needs to have are going to be those properties that are sort of adaptive for you, like in the broadest possible sense. So you're just sort of very, so like why, for example, does it make sense to say to desire food or something like that when you're hungry. Well, it makes sense to desire food when you're hungry because those are the nutrients and the kinds of things that you need to take into your body to do all this. But you're not thinking all those thoughts. You're just very roughly, you've just got this property that these things are going to be adaptive for you, as opposed to say staying away from being averse to poisons or things like that.
So the function of a desire is to do things that are not maladaptive or that are adaptive.
Yeah, the desire, the positive desire, and then we think of aversions or desiring not this particular thing are going to be the things that we contact with.
Right. So a desire is not fitting if it's not fulfilling its function. So its function is to make us do things that are adaptive.
Sorry, I'm sorry, this was like another talk, I think. So it would just mean that the object of the desire has the properties that it would need to have in order for the desire to fulfill its function. It's not that it would actually guarantee that it fulfills its function, and it's not even true. There might be other parts of desire might have like a high fail rate built in, which I think is true. So there might be lots of things that you desire, and desire is not going to be able to fulfill its function. You're never going to be able to actually, never going to be able to actually do its job or whatever, because there's a high failure rate built in. But there are certain things that if you desire those things, it will have the properties that it needs to have in order for desire to fulfill its function.
So the function of desire is to what's the dot.
This is a long story.
Okay.
Very roughly, just it gets you to do things that are adaptive, as it's adaptive in the most broad sense.
Okay.
So I think desire is a big catch-all for that category.
Okay.
But again, this is like, I need to tell you a really long story about each attitude and how, and the function that it has or whatever. And then map that onto, you can think of desire as a kind of has a part that needs to, like your digestive system, or like, I don't know, like a flour mill. There's some object that it needs to operate on, and if it's gonna do its job, it needs to take that particular object. And it's fitting when it does take that particular object. So if a hen, just to go to an even easier case, like if a hen broods eggs, then it's brooding, those eggs is fitting. Why? Because brooding is supposed to take the object of eggs, but if it broods, golf balls, then it's gonna be unfitting. Why? Because it can't fulfill its function. The object that it has doesn't have the properties that it needs to possess in order for brooding to do what it's supposed to do in the way that it's supposed to do it.
And just one, adaptive isn't to be scaled out in terms of welfare.
No, it's like completely evolutionary and adaptive.
And so we can go a little bit longer because we started late, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, that was a long, I don't know.
Skipping in front of anyone. Yeah, sorry, just picking up on this, and I realize this wasn't a talk on desire, but it seems to be part of the.
Yeah, it's fair,
analysis
yeah.
Of the account. I guess the sort of inchoate worry I had, and maybe it's just totally off base though, is that if like, it seems kind of indirect to say like, prudential value is a matter of, you know, fittingness to desire, and then you cash out desire in terms of like adaptiveness. Seems like it would be simpler, although wrong, to just say prudential value is adaptive. But if that's
Oh, I don't
wrong,
want to say that, yeah,
then why would it like become plausible if we like launder the like adaptiveness through an attitude when ultimately the target of the attitude is just adaptiveness?
Yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, this is a really good question. So think about, let me try my best to explain this account of fittingness first, because now I'm stuck on this. And if I can't get over this hurdle, I can't answer your question really well. Okay, so again, just think of what I'm trying to say in terms of, so very roughly, you can think of like, you've got these various responses and they have functions.
Yep.
And those responses often take an object. What does that mean? Well, what I want to say is that these responses have a certain kind of mechanism, and that mechanism was selected in part of the way in which it works is it works on something in particular, something very specific. Okay, so I think the easiest think about the difference between, say, like I don't know, your hair or your fingernails. They have a job, but their mechanism doesn't require that they take something and like sort of work on it in particular. But there are certain kinds of functions, like artifact functions are really easy. So they do, like, if you think about like a flour mill, it does require, like, say, wheat for it to work. There's some object that needs to have certain properties in order for this mechanism to do the job that it was supposed to do. In the right way. It can do it in some crazy deviant fashion, but in the way that it was supposed to do it. So think about the way attitudes work. So the easiest one is belief. So let's just go back to that one, because I actually think that one does fit the model of the normal category that we pick out for, like, beliefs being fitting is that they're true. So belief works. How does it work? Well, belief's job is to sort of give you a map of the world so you can navigate your environment and so on and so forth. So it takes certain objects, and that object, what property does it need to possess? It needs to possess the property of being true. And you could get beliefs to do their job in these deviant fashion or whatever. Maybe you have beliefs that sort of cancel each other out or whatever. You can get it to work in this deviant fashion, or maybe you have desires that sort of cancel out the beliefs. Anyway, you can get it to work in some deviant fashion, but the property that the object of that response needs to possess in order to fulfill its function is the property of being true. So that's how I spell it out for that. Now, desire is really, really complicated. So I don't have this like easy one I can just spit out. The story that I lean towards, but I'm very open to some good, evolutionary psychologist coming along and saying it's not this, is just this very roughly tracking adaptive, maladaptive properties, not under that description. Does that make sense? So you're not sitting there thinking, this is maladaptive or this is adaptive, but you've got a rough classification of things that, generally speaking, do they have this particular property? And those desires then are going to have a certain profile, and normally they're to realize that particular thing in question. So they have a job to do that. Once they combine with beliefs, they sort of are the blueprint. The beliefs are the way the world is, and that's all kind of mostly standard, but you can see how it fits into this story. You're trying to get those adaptive things and avoid the maladaptive things in your environment. The map is provided by your beliefs, and the sort of route to get there is by your desires. That's the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help? And then now you just need to start saying all the things like, well, look, if you're desiring really useless stuff, or if you are desiring things that are going to actually hurt you, then it's not going to have those properties. And so your belief or your desire is going to be unfitting. Why is it going to be unfitting? Because the object doesn't possess the properties that it needs to possess in order for desire to fulfill its function. in the right way. Okay, does that make sense? Good, okay, yeah, sorry. So to get back to your question, the upshot is supposed to be this. Well, look, once you've got that picture of desire up and running, well, then you can start to think about how that would play into having a certain story about consciousness. Okay, this gets really complicated because I actually think I've got a story about how the function of consciousness. So what you would do is you can have maladaptive phenomenal a certain phenomenal perspective, and you can have one that is really adaptive. And so in the good case, Humphreys has got this view. It's like part of the role of consciousness is like to make you want to feel alive and so forth. And why you have that? It's basically so that you do, there's lots of good things that come out of that that make you want to survive and reproduce for long periods of time and not just like throw yourself off a cliff or like who cares anymore, that kind of thing. Okay, so we would tell that story about consciousness, and you can start to see how the things that tend to map into again, I was just giving intuitive cases of what's fitting to desire about consciousness. They're going to fit into that story. Sorry, that was like a long-winded, but that was how I'd want to tell it. Because I do think if you don't do it that way and you try to do it in terms of like a lethic account or fitting this in terms of an lethic account or the other kind of popular account of fittingness is to cash it out in terms of I got alluding. Sorry. So anyway, like if you do it the lethic account way, it's going to definitely go into the kinds of worries that others have raised about the explanatory direction. Yeah, sorry. I'll say it will come to me when I leave. Yeah.
Okay, so we're out of time, so let's thank Andrew for and Andrew's got family in Hong Kong, so we won't have any official, there won't be any official.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. Thank you all for your great questions. Go ahead.